I don't think that anyone who has studied religion in any kind of depth could fail to notice just how important emotions are to the religious quest. But at the same time, I strangely think that the study of emotions in religion is one of these areas of academic inquiry that has been somehow underrepresented. I don't think that enough scholars take the issue of emotion in religion seriously enough to understand exactly how important it is to how religions are developed, to how religious behavior is expressed, and even to how particular religious ideas are formed. So if you go back to 3 of the first episodes that I did on this channel, where I talked about 3 key features of all religions, so there I discussed religious concepts, what they are like, religious groups, and religious institutions. And it's simply undeniable, I think, that emotions are integral to each of these 3 aspects of religion. So, in terms of the development of religious concepts, so the kind of things that religious people believe, with respect to gods and spirits and spiritual forces and things like this, these are characterized by what I termed in that episode a high degree of affective evaluative salience, which is just a snooty way of saying that all religious concepts are deeply ingrained with particular emotions and particular sentiments. So if you want to understand the Christian concept of God, for example, there's all these sort of abstract propositional doctrines that a Christian would be expected to abide by. So they have to have the correct view on the Trinity, for example. They have to ascribe certain properties to God, such as omnipotence, omniscience, things like this. But if you really want to be a Christian, I think it's also important to have the correct emotional attitude towards God. So, particular emotions and evaluations are baked into the very concept of what God is. So, if you have a Christian who says, yeah, God exists, yeah, the Trinitarian doctrine is true, but I don't really care, God doesn't really matter to me, that person is, in a way, I think, failing to understand what God is, at least according to the internal logic of Christianity. So, in the Christian tradition, you can't just have these particular sterile, dispassionate beliefs about what God is like. You also have to love God. You have to feel joy at the existence of God. These emotions are not just felt by Christians when they talk about God, but they are, I would argue, a key aspect of what the concept of God is for Christians. You can't talk about God without discussing these kinds of emotions, because those emotions are constitutive of what God actually is. When it comes to religious groups, as we discussed in the last episode, a key way to hold groups together and to form a kind of corporate identity within groups is through the sharing of particular emotions. So emotions are very powerful tools for social bonding. If you want to get along with someone very well, if you want to view someone as a sort of cooperative partner in life, it helps to be able to share the same kinds of emotions that they have and to experience these particular very strong emotions at times really helps human beings to come together, to form bonds, to develop a kind of cooperative trust, and so on. So you wouldn't be able to have religious groups, or at least you wouldn't be able to have particularly strong religious groups, I would argue, unless the members of those groups were able to come together and share particular emotional states at the same time. And finally, we have religious institutions. And plainly, there are many religious institutions which are designed consciously or subconsciously to evoke particular emotions. So I've spoken before about the difference between a Catholic Mass, for example, and a kind of concert experience that you would get at a evangelical megachurch. These are obviously rituals that are designed to stimulate very different kinds of emotions, and they also make it very clear to adherents exactly what sorts of emotions they are supposed to be feeling at particular times. So the Catholic Mass is there to stimulate a sense of sonority, majesty, wonder, awe, emotions like this, but relatively low arousal states, we can say. People in a Catholic Mass are not jumping up and down, clapping their hands, or anything like this. Whereas in an evangelical megachurch, if you are sitting there quietly in a sense of quiet contemplation, then you are missing the point. You are not going to fit in very well at that church. The goal of these churches is to whip people up into a very definite state of emotional arousal, and we will talk about why that would be the case, why particular religions would want to stimulate particular kinds of emotions. But for now, all we have to recognize is that at all three different levels of a religion, so religious concepts, religious groups, religious institutions, emotions run very deep in all of these aspects of religion. And so I don't think there would be anything controversial about that. I think scholarship has long recognized these kinds of contributions that emotions do make to religious practice. But at the same time, I don't think that many scholars quite recognize just how important this is, just how powerful emotions are in a religious context, and the virulence of the worldly effect that these emotions can generate. And I think this comes back to some misconceptions that people have about emotions, and this is what we discussed in the last episode. So I recommend, if you haven't done it already, to listen to the previous episode, episode 17, where I talk about some common misconceptions that people have about what emotions are really like. But if you don't want to go back and listen to that episode, or you don't have time, I mean, who am I to tell you what to do? But what we concluded by the end of that episode was that there are three key features of emotions that are going to be particularly relevant to understanding how it is that emotions function in a religious context. And these are, one, that emotions are about the world. They give us very particular signals about the relationship between our organism and its immediate environment. Two, they provide a very strong internal motivation to do particular things. So particular emotions like anger, like fear, like sadness, like happiness, these will reliably inform certain types of worldly action. They will spur us towards particular kinds of worldly action when we experience these emotions. And thirdly, emotions are a kind of social strategy. They exist, at least in part, to manipulate the behavior of others, to permit us to navigate a particular path in the world. So certain emotions are very good at socially assisting us to get particular things from the world. And the way that emotions function as a kind of infectious phenomenon, so emotions can spread to other people. The kinds of emotions that we have can affect people in different ways. These also pave the way for particular social strategies. Emotions can be used to help us get what we want in some way. And so as we discuss emotion in a religious context in this episode, it's important to keep those findings in mind. So we have to abandon this common attitude that emotions are non-cognitive, private states, that they are something intensely personal and subjective, that they are irrational. So if we continue with those misconceptions, then I think we're going to pretty easily underestimate exactly how important emotions are to religion and how big an effect emotions can have on religious practice and therefore on the world in general. And I think it's these sort of misconceptions which explain why scholarship has not really taken emotions in a religious context seriously enough. So that much I would say is relatively uncontroversial. Okay, emotions are important to religion, but what next? Well, the next thing to focus on, which maybe is a little bit more controversial, although it's still a commonly held idea in religious scholarship, is this idea that religions don't just give people particular emotions, they don't just make people feel particular things, but rather that religions are in the business of managing emotions, that there are particular strategies that religions employ to somehow produce particular emotions in people, or to guide emotions, or to dictate how particular emotions are and are not to be expressed. And as I said, I don't think this is a particularly rare idea in religious scholarship, but of course, we're starting now, I think, to talk about religion as a bit more of a nefarious phenomenon, that the idea of managing and controlling someone's emotions does sound a bit sort of, horrible and manipulative and so on. So there'd be many scholars who might try to downplay this aspect. But there's one author in particular who I think has an interesting take on this, even though, as will become clear, I don't really agree with him. And that is Stephen Asma, who has wrote extensively about how important emotional management is to religions, but what he attempts to do is to show that this emotional management is actually not a bad thing. We shouldn't be talking about manipulation or mind control or anything like that when we talk about the religious management of emotions, but he actually views it as a positive thing, that the emotional regulation that religions produce in adherents is actually to their benefit, and actually, we could even say, of great net benefit to humankind. So in his book, Why We Need Religion, and I think the title there will give you a pretty good indication of where he's going to go with this, but in this book, Stephen Asma writes, quote, "Religion's main function is not as a path to morality, nor can it substitute for a scientific understanding of nature. Its chief virtue is emotional management. Powerless people turn to religion and find a sense of relief there, and this helps them psychologically to stay afloat. Those who target religion and wish to abolish it, such as the Marxists and the new atheists, seek to pull away the life preserver, mistakenly blaming the flotation device for the drowning." End quote. Now, there's a lot of things to say about this, and we can maybe start with the more positive aspect. So Stephen Asma here does identify correctly, I would say, emotional management as a core aspect of religious practice. It might not be the primary function of religion, as Asma seems to be arguing here, but we can't deny that it is a very big part of religion. I also agree with him that the primary function of religion is not to inculcate a sense of morality in people. It's not there as a substitute for scientific understanding. I talked about this in greater depth in my very first episode on this channel. So he's right on those counts, but the rest of it is, I would say, almost infuriatingly wrong. So let's look at the metaphor first of all. So he describes religion as a life preserver that is keeping people afloat. And is that really an apt way to describe what religion is doing? I mean, are we all really drowning? But for the saving graces of religion, is the world really such a horrible place as all that we do need to somehow be rescued from this ocean of emotional turmoil? And I think here that Asma is buying into the marketing of religion somewhat. So I think I might have mentioned this in an earlier episode. The idea that is key to any sort of marketing practice is not simply that you want to sell a particular product, that, people have particular needs and you're going to make a product which fulfills those particular needs, and then you're going to market it by saying, hey, that problem you have, well, our product can fix this. But in fact, the way that marketing typically works is it doesn't just satisfy particular needs, it generates particular needs. So if you want to sell a bottle of shampoo, for example, you don't just want to talk about how nice your hair will look after using this shampoo, but what you will instead want to do first is to generate a need that people previously didn't have for having nice hair, for using shampoo which makes their hair look nice. So what you might do is to make people feel a sense of shame, perhaps at having split ends or dandruff or just having, lank, greasy hair. Like, who is going to take you seriously if you look that way? So it's going to generate almost a sense of shame or anxiety in people about having anything but the most beautiful, luxuriant hair that they possibly can. And when you instill that sort of negative emotion in people, this is where you can sweep in with the promises of your brilliant new shampoo that's going to make those problems go away. No more split ends, no more dandruff, no more lank, greasy hair. Our shampoo is going to solve that problem for you. But the important point here is that, of course, at least to a certain extent, that particular need to have hair of a certain quality is itself the very product of the marketing in the first place. So the shampoo commercials don't just satisfy needs which already exist. They first create a kind of need through the use of emotional manipulation, and then they are able to sell you the product which will cure that need that previously you never actually had in the first place. And I think that religious marketing operates on very similar techniques. So you don't just tell someone, hey, God is great, God will make you happy, God is going to send you to heaven, all of these sorts of things. What you first need to do is to instill the kind of need in people that would lead them to finding these sorts of concepts credible and important to begin with. So you can't just say, God is great. You have to say human beings are weak, pitiful, alone, condemned to meaningless lives, but God is great. God can fix these problems for you. Or you don't just say, God will give you a nice afterlife. You're going to tell people you are riddled with sin, you are on the way to hell, you are going to suffer for all eternity if you don't turn your life around. But hey, God can save you, God can rescue you, and grant you a nice afterlife where you'll be singing with Him and the angels for all eternity. But again, it's a sort of manufactured need. If you can tell people that their lives are horrible and meaningless, that they are weak, morally decrepit people who are completely alone and have no hope of saving themselves, then suddenly concepts like God and the other various so-called consolations of religion seem much more important. It's not simply that God is good, that God is great, but God is necessary to rescue you from these evils that I would say religion is at least partly complicit in creating in the first place. And Asma's analogy here seems to basically come straight out of the religious marketing playbook. We are all drowning. We exist in an ocean of suffering. We are condemned to lives of emotional turmoil. The only flotation device available to you is religion. I mean, that's not an academic position, that is just religious propaganda reappropriated in the service of an academic argument. So the analogy itself, I think, fails. Religion isn't really a flotation device, which is the only thing preventing us from drowning in a world full of horror and fear. I think a better analogy would be that human beings actually know how to swim, that sometimes it can actually be pleasant to be in an ocean, that it might be better to, learn how to swim rather than being dependent for your entire life on people throwing you flotation devices, but that's another story. I think that the problems with Asma's argument here run even deeper than that. So let's focus on the one particular emotion that he mentions in this analogy, and that is the emotion of relief. So again, this is almost a cliche about how religion functions, that it exists to somehow assuage our fears about mortality or other aspects of the world. That one of the primary functions of religion is to make us feel better about who we are and to feel better about our place in the world. And yeah, religion can do that. There are kinds of religiosity which perhaps make people feel more comfortable in the world, less scared of the world, and so on. But the emotional repertoire in religion is far richer than the mere relief from suffering, the mere relief from all of these anxieties and worries and fears that we might feel about the world. Religion, in fact, as we'll see in more detail in a moment, generates a stupendous wealth of different kinds of emotions under different circumstances and for different reasons. So religion doesn't just grant us relief, it can also stimulate emotions like joy or excitement, positive emotions like this. But we should also not lose sight of the fact that religion peddles to a great extent in negative emotions. It is very, very good at generating negative emotions in people. It does this with great regularity, and so we have to view the generation of negative emotions in a religious context as an integral part of what religions are. So, most obviously, religions, for example, can generate fears that otherwise wouldn't exist outside of a religious context. You can be scared of demons, devils, ghosts. You can be scared of sin. You can be scared of hell. You can be scared of your moral failings. You can be scared of improperly discharging particular religious rituals. There are no end to the number of fears and anxieties that religion is capable of generating in people. And again, the fact that it does so with such regularity tells us that these are kind of load-bearing emotions, that fear is an incredibly important part of religious practice, it's an incredibly important part of holding religious groups together, it's an incredibly important part of how religious institutions function, and so on. And you can do the same for every other kind of negative emotion as well. Think about the ways in which religions can generate anger and the way that they tend to fuel conflict through this sparking of anger. Think about how readily emotions like shame and guilt are peddled in a religious context. These are very, very powerful religious emotions. Now, obviously, these are doing some very important work in religion. They exist there for a reason, and we'll talk about why they exist in a religious context in a moment. But for now, let's just be clear that religion is not just about peddling relief. That is a very, very small part of any religious program. In fact, religion peddles a great range of emotions, and we therefore have to ask why. Why does religion sometimes make people happy? Why does it sometimes make them feel angry or fearful or ashamed? And what have you? the great regularity with which these emotions are evinced in a religious context should tell us that they are doing something very important, and we therefore have to investigate what those reasons are. We can't fall back on these tired old cliches about religion being a kind of gentle consolation to people, bringing a kind of meaning to their lives, ameliorating these negative aspects of existence, and so on, because it seems readily apparent to me that religion is at least as much the cause of negative emotions in the world as it is their consolation. So, if Asma is otherwise right about one of the primary functions of religion being emotional management, and to be clear, I think he is most definitely right about that, we have to ask ourselves why. Like, what is the point of religion creating all these emotions, peddling all these particular emotions, manipulating people to feel one way or another, and so on? What is the net benefit of this? So, this is one area where I find it very difficult not to make very reductive arguments and to simply say that if you want to explain a particular function of religion, why it's there, what it's doing, and so on, all you need to look to is how that particular function contributes to what we might call the reproductive success of religion. So it's a bit like asking a question, well, why does a tiger exist? And from a biological point of view, the only correct answer to that is, well, a tiger exists because it happens to be good at existing in the particular context it finds itself. It exists because previous generations of tigers have been good enough at existing that they were able to perpetuate their lineage, to reproduce, and to create new tigers. And really, that's the reason the tigers exist. They are just good at existing. They possess certain features which just make them well adapted to their environment and to continue existing. And I would use a similar Darwinian argument for religions. If you want to explain a particular feature or function of religion, all you have to ask yourself is, how does this contribute to the reproductive success of religion? And yeah, I know that this sounds horribly reductive. I certainly don't think religious people would appreciate religion being talked about in these terms, but it makes sense. If a religion is going to exist, it has to be good at existing in the world somehow. It has to be good at reproducing itself. If it fails on this count, then it's just going to disappear. And that has been the fate of 99.9% of all religious traditions that have ever been created. And they continue to be created on an almost daily basis, it seems. And some new religious movements have proven to be very successful. Most just fall by the wayside and disappear within a generation or two. But the point is, for a religion to be successful, it has to somehow be successful at continuing to exist in the world, at perpetuating itself down particular generations, at securing the adherence of particular believers and a willingness for those believers to stick together as a coherent group and to follow particular kinds of institutions. And so if we are asking why a religion has a particular feature, as reductive as it sounds, the first thing we have to do is to ask, how does that feature permit religion to perpetuate itself and to survive in the world? So if we ask ourselves the question, how does the management of emotions contribute to the survival and perpetuation of religious structures, the best place to start is by looking at those three key features of religion that I identified in the last episode and at the beginning of this one, and to see how these features of emotion might contribute to the success of religion in the world. So that first feature we identified, that emotions are about the world, they have a worldly intentionality, they signal to us something very significant and important about our relationship to the world. If religions are successful at managing emotions, that says that potentially religious regimes have a way of structuring in a very deep and intimate way how it is that we understand the world. So this is where we can again make reference to religious concepts. As we've said, religious concepts are simply sodden with this effective evaluative salience. But concepts in general are also the primary lens through which we interpret the world and give meaning to the world and make sense of the world. So if a religion wants to perpetuate itself, of course, it needs to perpetuate certain concepts that are central to the religion to ensure that people really take these concepts seriously, that these concepts are credible, and that people really use these particular religious concepts to interpret their station in life. And my thinking here is that if a religion can reliably associate particular emotions with particular religious concepts, then that is going to be a very efficacious way for a religion to increase the salience of its concepts. So that is to make them seem more relevant to people. It's going to ensure that these religious concepts are elicited by a wider range of worldly experiences. So if people feel a particular emotional state and they are prepared to link that emotional state to particular religious concepts, of course it means they are going to be thinking about these religious concepts more often than the case where these concepts are not connected to particular kinds of emotion. And it's also going to ensure that these concepts are more memorable and more likely to be transmitted. So, as we talked about in our episode on the cognitive science of religion, there are certain kinds of concepts which are more likely to be passed on than other kinds of concepts. And I would argue that concepts that have a strong emotional valence are going to be more memorable and more likely to be passed on from one human being to another, simply because they are viewed as more directly relevant and, maybe just more generally interesting to people. So Christianity, for example, is very successful at spreading its own particular concepts, I would say, because it's managed to wed some very strong human emotions with a very strong positive valence with specific religious concepts that are native to Christianity. So most obviously, the Christian is given to viewing emotional states like joy or bliss and love with divinity. In fact, Christians are fond of saying not just that God is loving, but that God is love. If you experience love in the world, then that is in some way a gift from God. So every time a Christian feels a sense of love or joy or bliss or positive emotions like that, these are emotions that are likely to elicit the concept of God. So it makes the concept of God more relevant and more readily available to cognition by virtue of its association with these strong emotional states. But also because merely encountering the term God or ruminating on God is likely to generate these kinds of emotions in the Christian. Again, this will serve to make these concepts feel more relevant, more interesting, and more likely for the Christian to pass them on. So if you've ever been trapped in a conversation with a Christian who is quite clearly attempting to proselytize to you, they're normally not going to start with these abstract definitions of God. They're not going to try to get you to believe in the ground of all being or the unmoved mover or necessary existence itself. What they're going to talk about more often are the kinds of emotional benefits that they experience from their faith. Talk about the joy they're feeling, the love, the comfort, positive emotional states like this are so integrally wrapped up with the concept of God in the mind of a Christian. And more importantly, these are seen as the primary virtues of God, that these are the qualities that make God interesting, that make him worthy of worship, and which inspire proselytization in the first place. So simply by associating God with these very powerful, very strong emotions, it ensures the perpetuation of the concept of God. It ensures that subsequent generations continue to believe in God. And this obviously contributes in a very deep way to the reproductive fitness, let's say, of Christianity. And it's exactly the same rationale with negative emotions. So if we take a concept like karma in Hinduism and Buddhism, this can often be wedded to negative feelings like fear or anxiety about doing the right thing. So the fact that karma is taken as something that's basically all-pervasive, that every single action you undertake in the world is going to have some sort of karmic effect, that can obviously have a very powerful influence over the degree to which particular Buddhist and Hindu institutions are able to be made relevant in the day-to-day activities of ordinary people. So if you can convince people that karma is a real force in the world and that they ought to be scared of the negative effects of bad karma, and indeed, a lot of Buddhist rhetoric, of Hindu rhetoric, really does play up the ordinary fears that people might have about karma, the kinds of horrible fates that await them if they allow their karmic ledger to degenerate into the negative. But if you can do this, if you can convince people that karma exists and that they ought to be very scared of the negative effects of karma, it is going to motivate them to participate in particular rituals which accrue positive karma, or, to give money to particular institutions, particularly the Buddhist Sangha, which is obviously going to contribute to the fitness of Buddhism itself. If you can convince people that they ought to be scared if they fail to give enough money to Buddhist monasteries, then that's going to be a pretty good motivation for people to do just that. And that is going to contribute to the institutional success of Buddhism. So you can see that in perpetuating the credibility of particular concepts, it really does help to have these concepts wedded to particular emotions, because emotions strike us in a much more intimate and forceful way than other cognitive processes. And so they are a useful way to make people pay attention to particular religious concepts, to particular religious institutions. And that is one reason why it is to the advantage of religious traditions to manipulate the emotions of their believers in this way. And the second feature of emotions that we identified was that emotions are very, very powerful motivators for worldly behavior. And in fact, we would say probably the primary motivator for action in the world. So if there are particular things that you want people to do in the world, and this is a key feature of what religious institutions are, religious institutions are basically just collective forms of worldly behavior in a religious context. So if you want people to perform these particular institutions, if you want people to engage in particular kinds of corporate behavior and the corporate observance of institutions, which is so integral to the generation of religious groups, then the best way to do that is through the management of emotion. And you can basically view religious practices, religious institutions, as a series of carrot and stick motivations, which are undergirded by particular emotions. So one way for religions to motivate their believers to engage with particular institutions is by making those institutions pleasant to be a part of. So again, for many believers, the thing which keeps them incorporated into a religious group and to continue observing a particular religious tradition is the kind of positive emotions that this adherence grants them. So partly this is social. There's something obviously nice and pleasant about being part of a tightly knit social network, of regularly socializing with people in places of worship, and experiencing that pleasant feeling of being emotionally in sync with people during particular religious rituals. So these are like religious carrots, these are attractors to religion. So the promise of experiencing these positive emotions is a good motivation for people to engage in particular institutions. But then there are also the stick approaches to religious adherence, where you can cultivate particular negative emotions in people, which also serve to motivate them to do or to not do certain things. So a Catholic might be motivated to participate in Mass because they happen to find Mass pleasant in some way, sure. But also, I think a lot of people, a lot of Catholics, observe the sacraments of Catholicism out of some sense of fear. And this can be, on the crudest level, a fear of God, like, if I don't discharge these sacraments properly, then I'm going to be put into hell, something like that. And of course, there are believers who think that way, but I think more commonly, the fear that exists relates more to social disapprobation. So if I start skipping Mass, if I start violating these Catholic sacraments, I'm obviously going to come in for some sort of social sanction. The Catholics around me are not going to tolerate that kind of behavior. And so this is liable to generate a kind of fear amongst adherents of all religious traditions that if they somehow fail in their religious duties, if they don't observe religious institutions with the requisite degree of meticulousness and commitment and so on, then they are somehow going to experience some negative social effects. They might be criticized or shamed. In more extreme cases, they might even be ostracized and excommunicated, something like this. But in every religious tradition, there are pretty clear ways that the failure to properly observe your religious responsibilities is going to carry with it some degree of fear, and wishing to avoid that sense of fear, avoid these kinds of negative emotions, is going to provide a very powerful motivation to people to do the things that their tradition expects them to do. And again, if everyone is engaging with particular religious institutions, that contributes to the fitness of that religious tradition. And the extent to which a particular religious tradition is liable to use emotional carrot techniques versus emotional stick techniques, or that is, the extent to which they are prepared to promote positive emotions as opposed to negative emotions as a motivating force, this is obviously going to be different from religious tradition to religious tradition. It's going to vary according to time and place. But one thing I'd observe here is that, unfortunately, negative emotions, and I'm sure I've read this somewhere, I can't remember the source, so you'll just have to take my word for this, but I do remember reading that negative emotions tend to be more motivating than positive ones. So that is to say that negative emotions like fear or anger are more likely to reliably inspire particular kinds of worldly activity vis-a-vis something like happiness or contentment. In fact, we can imagine that someone who is a little bit too happy, a little bit too content, actually has a motivation not to act. It can lead to a kind of existential complacency. And if you want people in your tradition to be actively engaged with that tradition, actively engaged with its institutions and the group as a whole, then you probably don't want people being too complacent. You have to give them a reason to act in a certain way. And so a lot of the time when people are thinking about the potential benefits of religion, they are going to look to these positive emotional states as a potential worldly benefit of religion. And they will even point to these as a reason why religion is able to perpetuate itself. So if religion does indeed provide joy and a sense of purpose and a sense of relief, as we've already discussed, then that might go some way to explaining why and how it is that people actually engage in religious behaviors and count themselves as members of religious groups. But if it is the case that negative emotions are motivating, it's probably these that we should be looking to when we are investigating why it is that people continue to choose to be religious. So if we look at something like evangelical Christianity, for example, it's tempting to say that evangelical Christianity is currently successful in the West at a time when Christianity itself, the mainline Christian denominations are in unequivocal decline. We might ask ourselves, how is it that evangelical Christianity continues to grow so strongly? And one of the answers to that question, and there might be some merit to it, is that evangelical Christianity is very good at generating intense emotional experiences that mainline Christian denominations are not. So all you need to do is to look at the noise and excitement that goes on in the average evangelical megachurch, compare it, to the average Anglican parish church or to a Methodist church, or even to the average Catholic church. And it's pretty clear that the emotional intensity that goes on in these evangelical rituals is far greater than what you find in these mainline churches. And the sociological explanation would be that these are the kinds of experiences that people really want from religion. These are the kinds of experiences that they are going to seek out. So in the sort of global marketplace of religions, evangelical Christianity is outperforming other forms of Christianity because of these positive emotional experiences. But what I would point to is that evangelical Christianity also, I think, does a much better job of perpetuating certain kinds of negative emotions as well, as compared to these more mainline Christian churches. So evangelicals, for example, seem to be much more comfortable discussing things like hell or eternal punishment or being alienated from God than the mainline branches of Christianity are. And if you can convince someone that they are bound for hell, that they are riddled with sin, that they are inherently sick and depraved people who are in need of the redemptive sacrifice of Jesus Christ, that's going to provide a pretty powerful motivation for them to join the faith than the mere promise of feeling happy or content, I would say. And evangelical Christians are also, I would say, much more comfortable with perpetuating what we might call social animosities. So evangelical Christians are not shy about talking about how evil and depraved gay people or feminists or liberals are. They are perfectly comfortable with channeling this sort of animosity towards particular social groups. And they are also much more comfortable, I think, with using strongly moralizing language, so reducing every ethical issue to a very stark black and white choice. And of course, this sort of moralizing language is going to implicate certain negative emotions with a moral valence. So again, things like shame and guilt are going to be very useful tools for evangelicals to use to promote certain kinds of behavior and to dissuade from other kinds of behavior. So, of course, this involves no small amount of moral hypocrisy, and it shouldn't escape our notice that an evangelical sense of moral propriety is often pretty flexible. If it is convenient for them, particularly in a political context, they will happily loosen this moralistic language a bit. So in finding common cause with morally dissolute strongmen like Donald Trump or Bolsonaro and other far-right populists throughout Europe, the evangelical can, of course, look the other way at a few of these moral transgressions, but it doesn't change the fact that highly moralistic language and the kinds of negative moral emotions that are connected with that are a very central feature of evangelical discourse, and I would argue that the promotion of these negative emotions is one reason that evangelical Christianity has outperformed mainline Christian denominations in recent years. And the third feature of emotions that we identified was this idea that emotions are a kind of social strategy, that it's something we employ in order to get what we want in the world. And one key feature of this idea of emotions being a social strategy is that our emotions, so the emotions we have and the emotions we choose to express, are to a certain extent at least a matter of choice, or something at least that we are responsible for. So people will tend to cultivate particular emotional dispositions. They will learn which emotions to express in which particular situations because these emotions carry a certain social advantage. They help us to get what we want in the world. And you can see this sort of deliberate cultivation of emotion, this decision to choose to be in a particular emotional state in a religious context because there are pretty clear social benefits to doing so. So I remember reading a blog a while ago. I used to read it pretty religiously, if you'll excuse the pun, by an evangelical Christian called Fred Clark. His blog was called The Slacktivist Blog. I'm pretty sure it's still going, and many of you may have encountered it. He was running through the Left Behind book series and pointing out all of the absurdities there. But the main focus of his blog overall was to identify some of the hypocrisies and failings in evangelical thought, and particularly evangelical moral discourse. And one of the things that he identified there was the fact that US evangelicals seem to be existing in a kind of permanent state of indignation and resentment. And it comes through in their literature, it comes through in their politics, but there does seem to be a sense in which American evangelicals deliberately cultivate a sense of indignation, resentment, emotions like this, and I would say the reason is because it's socially useful. So it's a fairly common trope, in this case not just within American evangelicals, but within all Christian nationalist movements, that their community is under attack, that they are being undermined by the government, by secular forces, by liberals, by Muslims, by immigrants, and so on. And the net result of that is that they tend to whip themselves up into a kind of paranoid frenzy where they feel that the world is out to get them, that they are under siege from all sides, that they are the last bastion of moral goodness left in the world, so they have to hold the fort. These sorts of tropes, as I said, very common in Christian nationalist movements. And I would say that these emotions are being deliberately cultivated. There is nothing happening in the world which should lead them to this sort of conclusion. I mean, in the US, for example, Christians still occupy every house of government. They are currently running the government. There is no one who could attain any real sort of power on the back of an anti-Christian message. They still represent the overwhelming majority of the country, and yet they allow themselves to indulge in this mass fantasy that actually they are being persecuted. that they are under siege, that they need to hold themselves in a permanent state of readiness because they have enemies on all sides. And the generation of this sort of emotional state, this extreme emotional state, carries certain social benefits. So if evangelical Christians are really able to convince themselves that they are under threat, if they are able to cultivate these feelings of paranoia and resentment, then they are much more likely to be politically engaged, for example. And even seemingly trivial social matters like evolution being taught in schools, or homosexuality being socially tolerated, or the children of immigrants being provided with healthcare in American hospitals, things like this, are going to become issues that evangelicals will fight virulently against. Even though these are matters that don't really personally affect them in any way, they still have the motivation to come out and fight against them because they are easily presented as sort of symbols of the ongoing struggle that evangelicals believe that they face in the United States. And so these emotions of resentment, indignation, and so on are easily leveraged by the evangelical community, by political conservatives, Republicans, and so on, into direct political action. And this is the primary benefit of the generation of these emotions that we would otherwise view as being deeply negative, and we would question why someone would want to go through life holding these sorts of bitter emotions within themselves. Well, the reason they do it is because there are definite, direct, obvious social benefits for living your life in a state of permanent indignation. And I don't just want to pick on evangelicals here, because you see exactly the same dynamics in nationalistic religious movements all around the world. So Zionists in Israel, for example, will happily leverage the very understandable Jewish fear of persecution as a means both of promoting internal support for the actions of the Israeli government and as a means of silencing external critiques of the actions of the Israeli government. So I hope I shouldn't have to point out that merely criticizing the actions of the Israeli state or actors like Benjamin Netanyahu does not make someone an anti-Semite. It does not mean they believe that the persecution of Jews is something that is morally justifiable, but it's another case where the reality of the situation doesn't really matter. So long as particular emotions can be cultivated within particular communities, so as long as that feeling of paranoia and indignation and resentment can be kept burning within the Zionist Jewish community, they are going to be able to use these emotions as a means of holding the group together, of buying support for particular political outcomes, and that is most certainly to their advantage. In the case of Islam, there are, of course, what we might call nationalistic Islamic movements. You might say that Wahhabism is a kind of nationalistic Islamic movement, or the Shiite Islam that is practiced in Iran has also been used as a kind of nationalistic tool. But in Islam, this phenomenon of grievance mongering, of indignation stoking, is perhaps clearest to me in the rhetoric of so-called Salafi Muslims. So this is a sort of transnational Islamic movement, a fundamentalist Islamic movement who believe that they are returning to the original, pure, pristine form of Islam, but very common in Salafi discourse. And this goes all the way back to the writings of Sayyid Qutb and other progenitors of the Salafi movement, that Islam is being beset on all sides by evil forces who are trying to persecute and marginalize Muslims, and the enemy here is especially defined as this vague and nebulous concept of the West. And, honestly, this critique is maybe not entirely without merit. The amount of damage that has been done in Islamic communities throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa, for example, by colonial powers, colonial Western powers throughout history. This cannot be denied, but Salafi paranoia about the dangers of the West go far beyond mere colonial intervention. There really is this myth-making program which sees Western forces as attempting to infiltrate Islam at every level, trying to undermine Islamic practices, trying to engage in genocide. I've seen plenty of Salafi Muslims on YouTube who are happy to claim that the West is attempting to extinguish Muslims from the face of the earth, but they are able to cultivate particular grievances and forms of paranoia against, a familiar array of enemies: the secularists, the liberals, the feminists, the homosexual lobby, whatever that means, and, of course, the Jews. So, in the Salafi mindset, all of these forces are arrayed against Islam, and even the seemingly smallest social matters of only tangential relevance to the lives of most Muslims can be transformed into matters of existential urgency, that women are permitted to dress how they wish and to make a career out of the home, that gay and lesbian people are able to be open about their sexuality and to be granted certain social rights. These are taken as movements which are designed specifically to undermine Islam. This is exactly the rhetoric that Salafi Muslims choose to use. So again, if you are able to stoke this sort of indignation, this resentment, this paranoia in Muslim communities in the West, this serves a particular advantage to particular interest groups within the Islamic community. Firstly, I think it does promote in-group solidarity, and this is particularly important for minority religious movements such as Islam in the West, that if you want it to hold together, if you want to prevent members of your community from being assimilated into the wider community, then you do need to stoke certain animosities against that wider community to peddle these myths that the wider community is somehow interested in infiltrating and destroying your community. So this is, again, a very common rhetorical trick amongst minority religious communities, not simply Islam. But if they are able to stoke these sorts of emotions, if people are able to keep those particular fires burning within themselves, then that is going to contribute to a sense of in-group solidarity. It's going to give people within the Islamic communities in the West a sense of common purpose, something to aspire to, something to fight against, and that is going to contribute to the success of the group. And we're not going to run through absolutely every religious tradition in the world here, but very quickly you can see exactly the same sorts of current in other religious traditions as well. So think of the way that particular negative emotions and resentment against local Muslim populations are used by Hindus, particularly those in the Hindutva movement in India. Think of the way that particular kinds of resentments are stoked and channeled in Myanmar and Sri Lanka by Buddhist groups there. So in Myanmar, this resentment is channeled against the local Rohingya Muslim population. In Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese majority are channeling resentments against Hindus and Muslims there, who are seen as sort of foreign invaders and undermining the Sinhalese Buddhist culture. You can even see this historically in Chinese religions, that there was a lot of animosity directed by Daoists and Confucians against Buddhism when Buddhism first arrived in China, and subsequently Chinese Buddhism has sort of become domesticated, particularly by its intersection with Daoist thought. So Chan Buddhism can basically be viewed as a kind of domestic Chinese religious movement. But the fact that this animosity did exist historically shows that these sorts of trends are nothing new and that they can exist within any particular religious tradition. And even in new religious movements, you very often get a very paranoid, resentful rhetoric, which again is used to reinforce group cohesion, that the wider world is out to get them, that they are being persecuted, that they always need to be vigilant about what's going on, that you might even need to sever ties with the wider world in order to maintain your sort of religious purity. So think about Scientology, for example, as a fairly paradigmatic example of how paranoia and resentment can be used to motivate believers within that tradition to remain closed off from the wider world and to view the wider world as a source of agony and moral decay. You get very similar rhetoric in other new religious movements as well. But what all this goes to show is that there are very definite social benefits to channeling particular negative emotions and for individuals within those movements to cultivate those particular feelings within themselves. But what I'd really wish to stress here is that the fact that individual believers within these traditions really do harbor these particular negative emotions is, to some extent at least, a product of their own choice. So if fundamentalist Christians or Muslims wish to be offended by women pursuing careers or gay and lesbian people holding parades, that is their choice. If a Jew wishes to be offended by someone criticizing the actions of the state of Israel, that is their choice. If a Hindu is offended by a Muslim selling beef, that is their choice, and so on and so forth. No one is forcing them to hold these opinions. There are other members within their religious community who hold contrary beliefs. It is not a necessary facet of being a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, a Hindu, or what have you, to hold these kinds of animosities, but people still willingly cultivate these emotions within themselves. They will seek out news stories and various forms of myths which will permit them to fuel these emotions, to continue holding these emotions with great virulence. There is absolutely no sense in which they should not be held responsible for the kinds of emotions that they direct to other people. If they are angry, if they are indignant, if they are resentful, they are so because they have taught themselves to be so, because they have chosen to be so. And you might well ask, why would someone wish to put themselves into this sort of state? Why would someone wish or choose to experience negative emotions like this every day of their life? And I can only speculate, but I think there are various reasons for this. So, as we've said, negative emotions serve a very powerful motivating force. So if someone is of a kind of weak spiritual disposition, let's say, it's going to be much easier for them to hold on to and perpetuate a particular identity through the use of negative emotions rather than positive ones. So if I am a Christian, but I have a lot of trouble living out these virtues of Christian love and tolerance and forgiveness and so on, the easiest path to me to hold on to my Christian identity and all of the various social benefits that involves is to channel negative emotions instead. Instead of Christianity retaining its relevance to me through these messages of love and peace and tolerance and so on, I can instead choose to define my Christian identity according to whom I wish to exclude from the group, according to whom I believe is attempting to undermine my Christian identity. Or another reason might simply be that these emotions feel good, and this is one reason why I think the distinction between positive and negative emotions is a little bit fatuous. The fact is that people like being indignant, I think. It can give them a sense of righteousness, of moral superiority over other people, that you are clearly a much more morally serious person if you can identify these manifest injustices in the world and spend every day of your life quixotically railing against them. I mean, I can understand why that might feel good to someone, and another reason might be that it just gives people a sense of meaning in their life. They are out there every day of their lives fighting against the forces of evil, promoting the good, and the motivation for this sort of external quest, as we've said, given the inherent motivating properties of negative emotions, might be to simply hold on to dear life to these feelings of resentment and indignation and other negative emotions like this. It simply gives you a reason to get out of bed in the morning if your hatred and anger towards the wider world is strong enough. Now, I might be accused here, and not altogether unjustly, of focusing too much on the negative emotions that are cultivated within a religious context, but I think a very similar logic applies to the cultivation of what we might see as more positive emotions as well. So I can use here my experience with Mormons, and I use a lot of public transport here in Prague, and it happens at least once a year that I'm stopped by local Mormon missionaries who attempt to have a conversation with me and, of course, eventually to invite me to their church. But what I can say is that through all of these interactions with Mormons, and I've probably had up to 20 of these in my 15 years of living in Prague, but every single one of them has been pleasant, and I have found every single Mormon missionary who I have spoken to be genuinely affable, to be genuinely nice and pleasant people. And I think that we can recognize this as a common feature of Mormons in general. I mean, it's almost a stereotype of Mormons, I think, that they are just sort of unflappably polite and pleasant and optimistic and so on. So there is obviously something that is happening in Mormon communities to generate this sort of positive outlook on life. And the more charitable interpretation of this, I would say, the more naive interpretation of this, is that there is just something so good, so decent, so pleasant about Mormon doctrines and Mormon practice that it just transforms people into nicer people, that this is just an inherently good religion. It really is bringing out the best in people. So maybe here we should give religion a little bit of credit. Maybe it really does have this transformative power to make people happy, to make people kind and nice. And while I wouldn't wish to deny that religion might sometimes have this power to transform people into happy, nice people, there is still an obligation upon us, I think, to inquire as to why. So, within a religious tradition, as we've seen, there are any number of emotions that could be promoted, propagated, elicited within people. There are any number of particular practices and ways of being in the world that an emotion can instill. So why is it that in Mormonism in particular, presuming these stereotypes are true, and as I've said, in my experience, they are pretty true, why is it that Mormonism promotes this sort of affability and happiness, this unflappably positive nature amongst its adherents? And I think a useful place to start to answer that question would be to look at some of the sociological work that's been done on emotions, and I'd particularly point to a book I read a while ago called The Managed Heart by Arlie Russell Hochschild, which was published a long time ago now. It was published in the 1980s, but I think that a lot of the things that she talks about in this book are still applicable, in fact, perhaps even more applicable today than at the time they were first published. So a key theory in this book is what Hochschild refers to as emotional labor. And here she draws especially on the experiences of women who are working in sort of service professions. So she especially focuses on women who were working as air hostesses in the 1980s and the kinds of ways in which they needed to manage their own emotions. So women working in this profession at that time, and I'm sure it still goes on today, were expected to always be pleasant and happy, and they were getting this sort of pressure from two sides. So first of all, there was a lot of pressure from the airline companies themselves. So one of the criteria for being hired into this position and keeping your job in this position was to maintain a sort of affability, to be genuinely smiley and nice to the customers. And then, of course, they also get the pressure from the airline passengers themselves, who had been sort of conditioned themselves to expect air hostesses to be extremely nice, extremely pleasant, extremely helpful, always with a smile on their face, and so on. And in this book, she describes the kind of pressures that these women, of course, must have felt, that no matter what was happening in their life, they had to maintain this sort of facade of affability in their job. And she goes on to describe the sorts of techniques that they use to maintain this facade, and the kinds of pressures and unpleasant consequences, of course, that can stem from attempting to maintain this facade. So I'm not saying that the sorts of pressures that airline hostesses in the 1980s and Mormons of today feel are the same, but I think something pretty similar is going on. So particularly if you are a Mormon missionary, so these are typically young men, I think, aged from 18 to 25, something like that. They are being sent out to all corners of the world to proselytize their faith. And in order to do this, they of course need to engage with people successfully. And the best way to engage with someone, the best way to get someone interested in you and to continue talking to them, is to be genuinely friendly, to ask lots of questions about that person, to show interest in that person, to laugh at the corny jokes they make, and so on. But generally, you want to provide a sort of bright, positive, cheerful mood to people if you want to engage them in conversation. If you're miserable and just want to grumble, people, particularly strangers, aren't going to want to listen to you. So I don't know exactly what Mormon missionaries are taught before they are sent out to the world, but I am absolutely certain that there is going to be a kind of pressure, whether implicit or explicit, to sort of present the best face of Mormonism, to show that this is the kind of community, the kind of church that someone might actually want to join. And the best way to achieve that is to ensure that its missionaries, the people who are out there proselytizing to the wider world, show a kind of sunny, cheerful, optimistic outlook, which of course reflects very well on the church itself. So in this way, I think that there is a definite pressure on Mormons to engage in a kind of emotional labor and to ensure that they do present this positive disposition to the world. But, of course, a key distinction that might be made here is that while air hostesses in the 1980s were probably faking this disposition to a large extent, could we really say the same thing about Mormons? Is it really fair for us to sit back in judgment and say, well, they're just faking it because it's to the advantage of their religious tradition? And it's here where I would again refer to emotions as a kind of choice, as a kind of social strategy, as a kind of way of getting on in the world. And to suggest that even if they are not faking it, even if they really are happy in a sense, or even if they really do believe that they are happy at least, that this doesn't mean that they aren't deliberately cultivating these emotions. It's not as though Mormonism is just such a happy place to be that they can't help feeling happy, but rather that every Mormon who feels happiness within the Mormon Church, to some extent at least, is feeling that emotion as a product of personal choice. They have been able to train themselves, or they have been trained by their community, by their families, and so on, to engage with the world with a happy and positive disposition. This is not an emotion that just washes over them like a gentle summer breeze. This is an emotion that has to be learnt and has to be trained. And we'll talk in the next episode about some of the more institutional techniques that a religion might employ in order to cultivate these sorts of emotions, but if we focus for now on how it might be that individual Mormons produce these emotional states within themselves, we can again point to particular concepts in Mormonism, so this idea that there is an all-good God, this idea that the Mormons themselves and anyone who is baptized into the Mormon faith after death will have a lifetime of bliss to look forward to after death, that all of the various tenets of Mormonism are both good and true. If you concretely believe in these concepts, if these concepts are the lens through which you view the world, then it makes it much easier for you to have a positive outlook on life. You can look at literally anything that happens in the world and identify in that thing some kernel of God's goodness, some kernel of a divine providence which is tenderly guiding the trajectory of all of existence. And so if this is your outlook on life, if these are the concepts you are using to shape your experience of the world, then it stands to reason that you really will be happy. This is not a happiness that needs to be faked exactly. When a Mormon comes to me and starts talking and they ask questions with a general interest about how my life is going, and they converse with a degree of affability which is sometimes admittedly a bit stilted, but still I would say very difficult to fake, I believe that they are really sincere in their happiness, in their conviviality with other human beings and with the world at large. But the fact remains that the holding of those concepts, their decision to remain within the church, their decision to maintain that the church and all its doctrines and practices are of paramount importance to their lives, all of these things remain choices. It is a choice to believe that there is a good God. It is a choice to believe that we are going to heaven. It is a choice to believe in the righteousness of your own cause. So even if the happiness itself is not something being faked or somehow disingenuously chosen, the things which cause those happy feelings most certainly are. And all of these factors put together contribute to the attractiveness of Mormonism, I think, to many people. I think when people are converting to the Church of Mormonism, they're not doing so because the doctrines are self-evidently true, or because the practices of Mormonism are particularly appealing, or because there are social pressures to convert to Mormonism, which all might be factors in people converting to other religious faiths. But in the case of Mormonism, I think that the attraction and the reason that it's one of the fastest growing religions in the world is because it seems like a community that is worth being part of. I really can understand that attraction. If Mormon people seem happy and affable, living good and decent lives, that is going to be a very powerful, attractive force. That is going to be a very effective way at expanding the size and the influence of the group. And there is definitely a wealth of sociological evidence pointing to similar conclusions as well, that the reason that people join particular religious movements, the reason that people undergo religious conversions and commit to a particular faith, tend to be more social in nature in this way, that people are attracted to elements of social bonding and social support that religions provide, as opposed to converting because they believe in the truth of particular doctrines or anything like that. And that is something that Mormonism has been able to do exceedingly well, and that is the reason that it is currently outcompeting, I would say, most other religious traditions in the world. Now, when I put it like all that, of course, it sounds a little bit Machiavellian, like there are Mormon leaders conspiring in a room, dreaming up ways of how they can expand their power. Of course, that is not what is really happening. I don't think that any Mormon is doing what it is that Mormons do because they have these grand designs on transforming Mormonism into a global power or anything like this. But at the same time, if we want to understand what it is that makes a religion function, why it is that a religion has the features it does, as I've said, we need to look at how these particular features contribute to the fitness of a particular religion, because if a religion has features which do not contribute to its fitness, then it's going to disappear. So I would say it's almost tautologically true to say that if a religion has particular features, those features must exist because they contribute to the fitness of a religious tradition, or at least do not present any obstacles to the fitness of that tradition. So some religious traditions use negative emotions to strengthen the bonds of the group and to motivate their adherents to engage in certain actions in the world which are to the benefit of the religious tradition, whereas Mormonism chooses to emphasize more positive emotions. These are both successful strategies under different sets of circumstances, but once again we have to recognize that emotions exist as a kind of social strategy, as a kind of motivating force, and that is why they are so powerful in a religious context. And I think that another useful case study to bring up at this point would be the way that positive emotions are cultivated in a religion like Daoism. So it's been a fairly well-established sociological finding, I think, that there is a distinction broadly between Western and Eastern conceptions of happiness, or more specifically, perhaps, American and Chinese conceptions of happiness. So in the American case, happiness is generally associated with a kind of state of physical excitement. It's a feeling of joy, of bliss, of excitement, and so on, where you feel energized, stimulated, seeking out novel experiences, and so on. Whereas in the Chinese case, happiness is conceived more as a state of what we might term contentment or tranquility or equanimity, something like this. So another way to say it would be that Western, or particularly American, conceptions of happiness involve high arousal states, whereas Eastern, or more particularly Chinese, conceptions of happiness involve low arousal states. And so it should come as no surprise then to find that the three major Chinese religions, Confucianism, Daoism, and Buddhism, all in some way attempt to cultivate these sorts of low arousal states of contentment, or at least that is the promise that they offer to adherents. And so the kinds of rituals and practices and doctrines that exist in these faiths are not geared towards generating strong emotions of either the negative or positive kind, but rather generating a kind of inner peace, a kind of equanimity with the world, a feeling of contentment that if you follow the practices of these religious traditions, that will be your reward, not an eternity of bliss. They are not attempting to cultivate anger or resentment, in fact, quite the opposite. They are attempting to instill in adherents a kind of tranquility. And they each have sort of different paths to that goal. So in the case of Confucianism, there is a big emphasis placed on rites, of course, the meticulous performance of rites, which are designed in contrast to certain other religious rituals, not to inspire strong emotions in people, not to whip congregations up into a kind of frenzy, but rather to perform these rites slowly, very deliberately, very precisely, and so on. And these are the sorts of rituals that are likely to inspire a degree of low emotional arousal. And there's also an emphasis in Confucianism of filial piety, of respect for traditions, of respect for authorities, of harmony within families and within communities. So again, the emphasis here is going to be on low arousal emotional states that are not going to cause divisions, they're not going to cause rancor, and so on. So this is how Confucianism cultivates what we might call low arousal positive emotions. In the case of Buddhism, there are pretty obvious doctrinal condemnations of clinging to ephemeral worldly pleasures, of finding too much joy in the transient things of the world, that if you pursue this kind of happiness, you're going to fail, it's just going to make your condition even worse. So these sorts of clingings and attachments to hedonic pleasure are, of course, to be avoided. And the Buddhist philosophy itself is set up not on the attainment of happiness or bliss, but rather the more negative pursuit of avoiding suffering. And if you follow the Buddhist doctrines, perhaps over many different lifetimes, once you've accrued enough merit, your reward is not going to be a lifetime of bliss, but the definitive extinction of suffering. That's a kind of low arousal, positive emotion par excellence. But what I'd like to focus on here is Daoism, and specifically Daoism's foundational text, the Tao Te Ching. So normally I counsel that reading religious scripture is not really going to help you with understanding how a particular religious tradition works. So, for example, reading the Bible is not necessarily going to help you with how Christians in the contemporary world think, because the bare text itself doesn't give you any indication of how that text is likely to be interpreted by contemporary believers. It doesn't give you any indication of particular traditions or practices or emphases that lie outside the text itself. So if you want to understand Christianity, say, the Bible is not really going to help you. And I'd say the same thing with Daoism. Although the Tao Te Ching is, of course, a foundational text of Daoism, it doesn't necessarily help you with understanding what it is that Taoists today really believe and really do. So this will be a discussion just on what the Tao Te Ching says rather than what Taoism itself believes. But to me, the Tao Te Ching is a very fascinating text. I don't think there is a piece of religious scripture in the world that has been more misunderstood than this text, particularly in the West. So there is a Western conception of the Tao Te Ching that it's a kind of mystical text, that it's a kind of exposition of the esoteric metaphysical workings of the Tao and, the sort of mystical forces which guide the cosmos. And there is a bit of that in there. Or there are people who would treat the Tao Te Ching like a kind of proto-self-help manual, which is teaching you certain practices, certain insights on how to achieve inner peace, how to live with gentle equanimity with the world. And again, there is a little bit of that, but what really struck me when reading the Tao Te Ching was just how much of the text seems to be addressed to political leaders, and how much of the text is devoted to sort of the optimal ways of organizing society or managing society. So this does not seem to be a text that was written for the Taoist laity. In fact, in a lot of ways, it doesn't even seem to be a text addressed purely to Taoists. There is obviously a very strong anxiety of influence in this text with respect to Confucianism. It does seem to address itself to Confucian thinkers as much as it does to Taoist thinkers, but more importantly, it does seem to be addressed to political leaders, that it does seem to place a great emphasis on providing teachings about the best way to manage ordinary people, how to lead them, how to guide them, how they are to be organized, and so on. So there are many examples of this throughout the text. I'll just choose one particular example. This is near the beginning of the text. This is the third stanza. I will read it in full. It reads, quote, "Prize not goods too hard to find, and people won't be turned to crime. These objects of desire unviewed, the people's thoughts remain subdued. Thus, under a wise man's rule, blank are their minds, but full are their bellies. Meek are their wills, but tough their bones. He keeps the folk from knowing and craving, and the intellects from daring to lead." End quote. So a few takeaways from that. So firstly, as we mentioned, this clearly does not appear to be addressed to ordinary people, certainly not to ordinary Taoists. It does appear to be addressed to people who have aspirations of leadership. This is a kind of guide on the best way to lead people. Secondly, it conveys, I think, a very clearly dim view of the capacities and aspirations of ordinary people. It talks about them as you might talk about sheep, as stupid animals who need to be herded and flocked for their own benefit. And thirdly, it prescribes a few general tips about how a leader is to cultivate this sort of attitude, how to properly herd people. And critically, it tells the leader that he must not permit the people to desire too much. So, keep luxury objects out of their view, or they're going to become jealous and turn to crime. The people should be meek, their heads should be empty of thoughts, they should have no aspirations whatsoever towards personal autonomy or towards leadership in their own lives. They should be, in the words of the text, subdued. They should be meek, and for the author of this text, that is the ideal state for people to be in order to form a happy, cohesive society. Now, I think that to contemporary Western audiences, this sort of text should rightly fill them with skepticism, if not an emotion more properly approximating disgust. This really is a very authoritarian text. It really is a text which is very anti-humanistic, which seeks to quash aspects of human existence that I think we are conditioned to view as being very important, such as personal autonomy, intellectual freedom, the luxury of desiring and aspiring to particular things in the world. This text, point blank, says the population should not be allowed to have this. A good leader is not going to make those sorts of concessions to ordinary people. But we can maybe attempt to interpret this a bit more charitably if we view it as just simply the logical consequence of the philosophy of Daoism. So Daoism says that everything that happens is really just an emanation of the Tao. So Tao translates as something like the way. So basically, the Tao is the way which determines how everything in the world is, how everything in the world behaves, and there is sort of no escaping this grand cosmic mechanism. So a popular metaphor in Daoism is to discuss the Tao as though it were a surging body of water. So if you can imagine being in a river, your canoe capsizes, you're struggling there in a rushing torrent of water. At that moment, it might be in your best interest not to fight against the current. If you try to swim in the opposite direction, if you believe that you can be stronger and faster than this surging current, you are going to get yourself into a lot of trouble. So the best thing to do might be to simply keep your head above water, let the river take you wherever it may. That is the best way to deal with the situation. And by analogy, since everything that happens in the world is a necessary product of the Tao, the way, there is no point fighting against it. Everything is going to take its own course. You can't really stop the Tao from carrying you where it wants, so therefore it's better not to fight against it. It's better to enact a philosophy of wu-wei, of non-action, and this is the best way of living in consonance with the Tao, so you accept the Tao rather than rebelling against it. And by doing this, by accepting your fate, by accepting that the Tao is in control, you are going to live a happier, more comfortable life. And so if that is the philosophical core of Daoism, so this argument would continue, this sympathetic argument, we would naturally expect certain doctrines, certain practices to follow from that. So, as we've already said, wu-wei, this counseling of non-action, arises pretty inevitably from this sort of philosophy. So if the Tao is in control, if the Tao is the way with a capital W, then there's no point fighting against it. The Tao is not simply how things are, but the way things must be, perhaps even the way things should be. So if you try to rebel against the Tao with particular actions, you're just going to make yourself miserable. Better than to adopt this policy of wu-wei, of non-action, and allow the Tao to take you where it wishes. And it also leads to a pretty idiosyncratic definition of righteousness, which again can be contrasted with Confucianism. So the Confucians believed that people were born not necessarily evil, but certainly wild, that people needed to be trained, they needed to be domesticated. This was one of the functions of the observations of the sacred rites of Li in the Chinese terminology, which could be viewed as a kind of social program of disciplining people, of getting them to understand what is important, and like training them to be better people, people who could be trusted to exist in a state of civilization. But for the Taoists, of course, if everything is guided by the Tao, that includes human nature. And so for the Taoists, righteousness, or Dai, that this is where Tao Te Ching comes from, Tao, the way, Dai, righteousness. For the Taoists, Dai was a part of human nature. So much like everything else in nature, human nature is a product of the Tao, and therefore the best way for people to be righteous was to simply live in consonance with the Tao. They didn't need to learn anything, they didn't need any particular training. In fact, if you want to live in consonance with the Tao, it's actually better in some ways to have an empty mind. You are living more instinctively, you are just following the paths of least resistance. You aren't having a strong emotional reaction to your situation. You're not thinking too deeply about your situation. This is the best way to be, and this indeed is the path to righteousness. So, a sympathetic treatment of this passage would say there's actually nothing objectionable here if you understand Taoist philosophy. This is just what Taoists believe is necessary to achieve righteousness. It is indeed important for people to have empty minds, to be meek, not to rebel against their circumstances, not to have strong desires or emotions. This is simply the path to inner fulfillment. This is the path to righteousness. So the text has to be read in that particular philosophical context. But as I've stressed throughout this episode, I think we can do a bit better than that. We can dig a little bit deeper. We can be a little bit more skeptical about what's going on here. And what we can ask, of course, is why were these concepts chosen in the first place? Why was it that the Tao was described as this sort of force? Because there were other conceptions of the Tao or Taos in general in Chinese philosophy and Chinese thought. Why did the Taoists alight on this particular understanding of the Tao? Or why did they imagine that the Tao was something that had to be submitted to, that demands inaction in response to its existence? There are any number of different paths that Taoism could have taken, any number of different concepts that Taoism could have generated, any number of different practices they could have recommended to deal with these metaphysical issues. But the fact is that Taoism alighted on this concept of the Tao, which demands inaction, thoughtlessness, submission, qualities like this. And yeah, we have to ask ourselves, why would this be the case? How would this have contributed to the success of Taoism? And it's important to remember that for a very long time in Chinese history, Daoism was an incredibly potent political force, not just a significant religious or philosophical set of ideas, beliefs, and practices, but actually a kind of rigorous political program. And there have been times where various states within what we would now call China were set up essentially as Taoist theocracies that were run by Taoist priests, in which political leaders performed only Taoist rituals to the exclusion of everything else. And even during particular Chinese dynasties, there was an incredibly strong Taoist influence to the exclusion of everything else, so particularly the Tang dynasty from the 7th to the 10th centuries was very heavily influenced by Taoism. And there were a number of predictable social costs to this, so when Taoism had access to political power, it proved to be just as violent and exclusionary as any other religious system. So again, particularly during the Tang dynasty, there were basically pogroms against Buddhists, monasteries were burnt, monks were killed, particular Buddhist practices were outlawed, and so on. And of course, much of this happened much, much later than when the Tao Te Ching was actually written. But we do have to keep this sort of political context in mind, that Taoism was very useful to leaders in Chinese society, I think, for these very reasons. It gave them a sort of template and a legitimacy for ruling in a particular way. It justified keeping peasants in a state of ignorance. It justified denying them particular luxuries that were not denied to the aristocracy. And it justified a particular form of government. I think this has been referred to as something like the light touch form of governance, which says that leaders don't need to be heavy-handed in their involvement in the population, that the Tao will sort of run its own course, so leaders don't really need to intervene, or indeed they shouldn't intervene, to prevent these things from happening, which sounds like a nice idea, perhaps. It sounds like an anti-authoritarian idea, but of course it can be used as an excuse for not really providing people with the things they need. All they need are full bellies, according to the Tao Te Ching. everything else basically should be denied to them. They should exist, and leaders should ensure that they exist in a state of meekness, a state of material deprivation, lacking personal autonomy, and even being denied the right to particular emotions and thoughts. And it's pretty easy to see why this sort of approach might be attractive to any aspiring authoritarian who wants to unite particular territories and bring people under his rule and so on. And for the purposes of this episode, what we should observe is that one way that this is achieved in Daoism, or the way that Daoism is used to justify these sorts of particular behaviors, is to manage the emotions of people, to suggest that particular emotions and particular thoughts are against the Tao, that they upset the natural balance of nature, they interrupt the harmony between human beings and the very cosmos itself, and therefore there are certain emotions, well, all emotions really, are to be dampened, to be quashed, to be denigrated as contributing to chaos and disharmony in the world. And if you can cultivate that sort of emotional state in people, if you can make it so that they really don't feel strong emotions in reaction to their particular political situation, then that, of course, is going to be of advantage to the ruling classes. It is going to be more likely for them to commit to particular Taoist institutions and to fund and to sponsor Taoist institutions, because these institutions are useful for leaders, and that, let us be clear, contributes to the success of Taoism in the world. So again, we don't have to imagine that Lao Tzu was sitting there trying to dream up the best way to control people politically and to put them under his thumb. I don't think we have to go that far. But if we want to look at the success of Taoism in the world, particularly in the Tang dynasty and earlier in Chinese history, then we have to look to these particular advantages that it offered the ruling classes over competing religious or philosophical systems, to suggest that the adoption of Taoism by ruling classes would be a kind of competitive advantage to Taoism over other faiths, and therefore to say that the particular doctrines in Taoism, such as Wu-Wei, such as the promotion of meekness, the dampening of emotion and thought, are not really there because they are in the people's best interests necessarily, and certainly because they don't reveal some profound truth about the nature of reality, but rather because they are politically useful. It is politically useful to cultivate a population who are severed from the kinds of emotions and thoughts which might otherwise lead them to rebel against the ruling classes, against the unfairness of their situation. So I hope that the last two examples of Mormonism and Daoism show that there can be self-interested reasons for a religious tradition to promote emotions that we might otherwise describe as being positive, that these traditions aren't necessarily promoting these particular emotional states because they are to the advantage of the people, but rather because they are to the advantage of the religious traditions themselves. And as we've said, if they weren't to the advantage of the religious traditions themselves, then the religious traditions themselves wouldn't exist, or those practices would not exist within those religious traditions. But still, some people might ask, well, what's the problem? If religion like Mormonism makes people happy, if a religion like Daoism gives people a sense of inner peace and tranquility and equanimity with the cosmos, what's the problem? Isn't that what we want in life? Don't we want to have these positive emotions? And if religion, or at least certain religions are capable of promoting these emotions and genuinely making people feel happy or peaceful, then what is the problem? Isn't this a good thing? Shouldn't we be celebrating religion for these sorts of consequences? Well, predictably enough, I'm going to say no to that question. And the reason why I don't believe we should necessarily be celebrating the sense of happiness or peace that religion might grant us relates to one of those properties of emotions that I discussed earlier, and that is the importance of emotions to achieving a kind of homeostasis between the organism and its world. So, as we said, emotions are typically the strongest and most immediate signal we have that our needs and wants in the world are being met or not. So, if we exist in a religious regime which seeks to manage and control our emotions, as I argue that all religions do, there is going to be the very real danger that our awareness of our place in the world, of how life is going for us, of what the world is really like and whether it's to our advantage or not, is going to be severed. So, if we are not getting authentic emotional reactions to our situation, if we become alienated from our emotions in this way, we are also going to be alienated from our world. We have lost potentially the most reliable signal that we have about whether our organism is really in a state of sustainable homeostasis with our environment or not. And it sounds a little bit abstract when I put it in that way, but I think that there are some very direct, very important consequences to this. So, the first thing we might look at is a kind of Marxist argument against religion. So, you know that Marx has that famous phrase about religion being the opium of the people, the sigh of the oppressed, things like this. Well, you don't have to be a Marxist to recognize that there is some truth to that religion has been used as a kind of tool of mollification, of numbing people to their circumstances. So religions have these doctrines, these provisions that, hey, your life might suck right now, but don't worry, if you remain meek and compliant and submissive, if you enact the institutions we have set forth for you, you will get your reward later, maybe after you are reincarnated, maybe in heaven, something like this. But the point is that if you promise not to cause too much of a stir, if you accept your circumstances in a state of gentle equanimity, accept that this is how things must be, then you will be rewarded later. And this is a perfect sort of doctrine for any would-be authoritarian to latch on to. Because if you can convince people that they ought to submit to a divine authority without question, it is a short step to say they should submit to earthly authorities without question as well. And the intersection of religion and political power should tell us pretty clearly that this is not just an accidental byproduct of what religion is. This is at the very core of what religion is. It is a means of social organization. Less charitably, we would say it is a form of social control. But the managing of people's emotions is going to be a key part of that. So I'm going to quote you a passage from a book written by Ole Rees and Lena Woodhead entitled A Sociology of Religious Emotion. And if you really want to understand how it is that emotions are used and managed in a religious context, I recommend turning off this podcast now and just going to read that book instead. It really is the best book on the subject that I've read. But they write, quote, "It is clear that the ways in which religious emotions support political, economic, and other forms of social power can and have reinforced forms of social inequality. For example, religions may diffuse the feelings of anger that could be provoked by undertaking demeaning forms of labor, by teaching that these should be treated as forms of devotion or penance to be undertaken with joy and acceptance. By presenting certain racial, class, or gender characteristics as divinely ordained, they may inculcate a sense of humility and dutifulness. By stigmatizing certain forms of sexuality or sexual behavior, they may inculcate shame and guilt among whole categories of people with corresponding power implications. Equally significant can be the prescription of certain emotions among certain categories of people, such as anger among the oppressed or resentment among the poor." End quote. So this sort of ties together a lot of what we've already been saying. So the first thing to note is that there are really two main ways that religion can manage or control our emotions, and we've talked about them both. So one is to stoke or enhance emotions, to put people in a state of high emotional arousal. The alternative strategy is to dampen emotions, to put them in a state of low emotional arousal. And all religions, I think, will carry a mix of these two strategies. The point is that you want people feeling certain emotions at certain times when that is to the advantage of the religious tradition itself. So Rees and Woodhead there talk about, for example, the promotion of the feeling of joy in association with certain forms of labor or other difficult practices. So, as an example, we might look to Scientology, who, of course, require their members to engage in extremely difficult labor for extremely little pay. I believe that members of the Sea Org are required to sign 1 billion year contracts or something ludicrous like that. But the point is that this kind of labor that is obviously to the advantage of the Church of Scientology is promoted by the church itself as a kind of blessing, as something that people should do joyfully, as something they should welcome. And there are a number of arduous practices in many different religions which might be presented in the same way. So I'm thinking here particularly of the work that women are expected to do in religious traditions, where often they are charged with the responsibility of taking care of the home, raising children, taking care of the husband, and so on. They are denied a degree of personal autonomy. They are, in many cases, not really counted as fully human, I would say, in many different religious traditions. And yet they are expected to accept this sort of unpaid, very difficult, emotionally difficult labor with a sense of gratefulness that this is something they should be happy about, that God has granted them this opportunity to stay at home, to keep the house clean, to raise the children, while the husband goes to work and, quote unquote, takes care of her. So this is just one example of religions demanding a kind of labor that would ordinarily, under normal circumstances, be viewed as an unfair imposition, but which is imposed on people with the expectation that they feel joy in response to this. That, yes, this is hard work, this is difficult for you to do, but you should feel blessed, you should feel joyful at the opportunity to do this work. Well, what this is doing is severing someone's natural reaction to difficult, pointless work, which would be something like boredom, anger, frustration, emotions like this. You are cutting them off from these emotions, demanding that they feel joy instead, sanctioning people who refuse to display the requisite amount of joy. And in doing this, you have alienated people from their emotions. You have alienated the human organism from its environment. It no longer is capable of leveling appropriate judgments about the extent to which its needs and wants are being met by its current situation. Or the authors there also describe the management of morally salient emotions, emotions like disgust or shame or resentment. And the relationship between religion and morality would be an entire episode on its own. But if we think about the way that religions manage these emotions, the kinds of moral emotions that are cultivated in response to certain situations, again, we can view a kind of alienation, of a severing between the human being and her world, which prevents her from having the appropriate moral emotions to improve her situation. So, again, if we look in a political context, emotions like disgust and resentment are channeled by ruling classes towards particular groups of people. So here they mention gay and lesbian people, and of course these have been a very popular target for wannabe authoritarians as a means of, sowing social divisions and enhancing their grip on power. But in the current political climate, think of the way that immigrants have been demonized in populist political discourse. So think especially of evangelical Trump voters who have voted for Trump in every election he's run for in stupendous numbers. I think it's something like 80% of evangelicals at the last election voted for Donald Trump. Donald Trump's primary policy initiative, if we can call it that, was anti-immigration. We are going to deport all of these families who are taking your tax dollars, who are making your lives worse. They're bringing drugs into the country. They are ruining the fabric of this country, and so on. Now, this is a great piece of political misdirection because there are people in America, including evangelicals, who have legitimate grievances about the direction in which the country is heading. There is gross inequality in the United States. Inflation has increased. It's become more and more difficult for people to live to a comfortable standard in the United States, and the situation is declining. So it is perfectly natural for people in this situation to feel anger, to feel resentment, to even feel disgust towards the people who have permitted this situation to occur. So what the Trump administration does is to redirect these moral emotions, and instead of having these moral emotions directed at their appropriate target, these emotions have been co-opted and targeted towards immigrant populations instead. So now you have evangelical Christians who sincerely believe that the reason that their life sucks is because of a working class Mexican family who emigrated to the United States 20 years ago, rather than, the billionaire and political class embodied perfectly by men like Donald Trump, who are governed by greed, who have no interest or understanding of the travails of ordinary people, and whose policies are explicitly designed to benefit those who are already wealthy, who are already powerful, at the expense of everybody else. So once again, we can say that the average working class white evangelical has been alienated from her moral emotions. In some ways, she has the appropriate emotion to her situation in life. She does feel anger, she does feel resentment, and so on. but she's unable to apply those emotions to the correct targets in the world. The link between organism and world has again been severed, and we should not be surprised that this has taken place. We should not be surprised that white working class evangelicals have been convinced so easily to vote against their own direct interests, because they have been conditioned for their entire adult lives by a religion which seeks to alienate them from their emotions in this way and to prevent them from leveling sensible moral judgments. That is not a bug of evangelical Christianity, that is a feature of evangelical Christianity. You don't want people understanding the true state of affairs. You want to manage people to herd them into particular conclusions which are politically beneficial to certain members of the ruling classes. And my God, do I sound like a Marxist right now, but that, I think, is the state of reality. And there are countless examples of this from all the different religious traditions of the world, and there's a particular class of beliefs which are referred to as system-justifying beliefs, which religion is also very good at peddling. So think, for example, of the way that lower caste people in Hindu societies accept their lot in life because it is taught that this is just the way of the cosmos, this is your particular dharma, you can't change this, you have to accept your station in life, and if you discharge your duties of your particular caste well enough, well, hey, who knows, maybe you'll be reborn as someone more important in the next life. But again, these sorts of beliefs in a Hindu context serve to dampen the sort of anger and resentment that people would ordinarily feel, and I think rationally should feel, at being disenfranchised, alienated, and excluded from the wider society for no other reason than they happen to be born into a particular class of people. So this is one reason why I think the argument that religion makes people happy, it gives them a sense of inner peace, is not necessarily an argument in favor of religion. There are some situations, there are some environments we exist in where things like anger, resentment, and these otherwise negative emotions are, I think, the most appropriate reaction to one's situation. If one recognizes this sort of imbalance between what one's organism needs and what one's organism is being provided by one's environment, particularly by the political classes who manage and control this environment, then feelings of anger are not just appropriate but necessary in this case for things to change. Anger is the best motivating force that people have to go out and improve their situation, to demand that their situation be improved. So if you teach people that happiness, peace, contentment, that these are the emotions you should be striving for, if the dispossessed really internalize this message and believe that everything will be okay, that happiness, gratefulness, joy are the most appropriate responses to their situation, then their situation is not going to change. It's not going to improve. Happiness in this case is an obstacle to genuine fulfillment. And so, to the extent that religion does make people happy, even people in the most miserable of circumstances, I don't necessarily view that as a positive thing, because it really is alienating them from the only means they might have at their disposal to truly improve their situation. So these are some of the social costs of the religious management of emotions, but I think that there are also problems at the individual level. So again, if we're going to view religion as a positive to the extent that it grants people a set of tools to cope with difficulties in their lives. So to return to Stephen Asma's analogy that religion can be a kind of flotation device that they can use to keep their head above water. It can grant them a sense of relief to all of these existential troubles they might have. So we might still say that even if religion and its management of emotions causes particular social dysfunctions, it might still be in the individual's best interest to pursue a religious life in which they do find this feeling of peace and comfort and security, as opposed to living a life of abject terror, misery, and so on. But even at the individual level, I think that there are difficulties here as well with people who allow their emotions to be externally manipulated by particular religious institutions. And I think that the best example of this is what has been termed spiritual bypassing. And this is a term that I first encountered in a book by Dave Verhagen called How White Evangelicals Think, The Psychology of White Conservative Christians, which again is a book I can recommend as having a lot of interesting insights into the psychology of religious belief. But he describes spiritual bypassing in this way, so quote, "Spiritual bypassing involves the use of spiritual explanations or strategies to avoid dealing with challenging emotional issues. First described by John Wellwood in his book Toward a Psychology of Awakening, he showed how people can use spiritual and religious ideas and practices to sidestep difficult emotional struggles. People who rely on spiritual bypass to cope with anxiety are more emotionally repressed, detached, and blind to their own failures. They talk in let go and let God language. Spiritual bypass also leads to more controlling behavior, addictions, and failure to take personal responsibility." According to one author, spiritual bypass compromises long-term spiritual well-being because it leaves the process of spiritual development incomplete. People who use spiritual bypass have less healthy, less engaged relationships. They have great difficulty being empathetic towards others who are struggling, which in turn promotes narcissistic traits. They suffer greater emotional problems, being more prone to chronic negative emotions and sometimes even obsessive-compulsive symptoms. It's not uncommon for those with a personal history of trauma or neglect to use spiritual bypassing as a way of protecting themselves against upsetting thoughts, feelings, or memories. Spiritual bypass causes people to get stuck emotionally, resulting in less spiritual growth and greater emotional immaturity. They rely on magical thinking or over-spiritualized solutions to problems in their life. End quote. So I'm not even really sure if there's much I need to add to that. Basically, we have a situation where religion provides people with a set of emotionally salient concepts which dictate how they are supposed to feel in particular situations, and this inevitably leads to a kind of arrested emotional development. So instead of greeting particular problems in their life with the appropriate emotional state, the goal of many believers is simply to repress those emotions, to place their trust in the goodness and the love of God, and so essentially to fail to address the problem, to address what should be their appropriate emotional reaction to the problem at all. And this relates back to what we said in the last episode about emotions being at least potentially rational in nature. Rationally, there are some things that we ought to feel in particular situations, and I would argue that if we don't have that particular emotional reaction, if we don't feel anger at being wronged, if we don't feel grief at losing a loved one, we are, in a very deep, very real sense, being irrational. And that's essentially what spiritual bypassing involves. So if your religious tradition teaches you that the appropriate response to being wronged is to turn the other cheek and to let them have another go at you, that is irrational. If your religion teaches you that you shouldn't feel aggrieved at the death of a loved one because they are in heaven now, so really you should be smiling, not crying, that is irrational. And if we return to my earlier example of what I think is the genuine happiness of the Mormons I've encountered, again, I would say that that happiness, at least in many situations, is deeply irrational. Even if it is sincere, even if they believe that they genuinely have cause to be happy, their unflappable positivity, their happiness, is not a sign of emotional strength. It is a sign that their emotions are stunted, that they are, as we've said, in a state of arrested emotional development. To be an adult, to make rational decisions, to make moral decisions about what we are to do in the world, we need to be in connection with our emotions. We need to ensure that we are getting the appropriate emotional response to particular disturbances in our environment. And spiritual bypassing, again, completely severs that relationship that should obtain between organism and world. We become alienated from ourselves, alienated from our situation, and even if we claim to be happy, even if we are sincerely happy, it doesn't change the fact that this is a very immature perspective on life, and in order to be fully developed human beings, even spiritually developed human beings, as the author here suggests, we need to be able to process emotions authentically. We need to be able to learn how to have appropriate emotional responses to particular things that happen in the world. And the external management of our emotions by religious traditions, even if these are positive emotions, even if they make us feel good, are undeniably, in my mind, getting in the way of that process, alienating us from both ourselves and from our world. And so I think with that, we can finally bring our discussion of emotions to a close. I was thinking about doing a third part in this series where I talk more about the particular techniques that religions use to manage emotions, but I think I'm going to save that for a much more distant episode in the future because I'm frankly sick of talking about emotions by now. Anyway, as usual, I hope you were able to get something from this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. See you again next time. Bye-bye.